evening, everyone.
So, a little bit about my story. It began from an experience with death for me. I was, I guess you could say, lucky enough to experience death later in life. So first, on our street, one of our close neighbors passed away. Her name was Jennifer Cunyon. The anniversary of her death was actually yesterday, so we went and took out flowers to her. And her husband is also a close friend of ours. Our other neighbor happens to be my grandmother, and my grandfather was with us until about a year ago. And so his loss has been really hard for me. But then it was interesting, on our street we kind of had these parallel losses that happened. And I was here at Davis while this happened, but I heard that Jake, the husband, and then Janie, my grandmother, they decided to go out one evening because they hadn't been out in so long, and they joked that it was a date. And I heard of that, and when I get these ideas for stories without realizing they're ideas, and they just stay shelved somewhere in my mind. And I wrote this very short piece. It was maybe a page just about these two people whose lives intersected, and I knew that they both had dealt with grief of some kind. And then I shelved that away for a while. And then recently in fall quarter, I brought it out, and I wasn't taking any fiction workshops, but I realized that it was something that was really part of my life, and I should still do it even if I'm not taking the classes. So I brought it out, started to work on it, and it became a good place to bury things. Mm-hmm. And so I hope you enjoy it tonight, and I would like to welcome Lisa to the stage.
A Good Place to Bury Things by Emily Masuda. Not once had her husband visited her in her dreams since he died, and she had felt a residual bitterness toward him for that, but tonight he came. In her dream, he had stood from his wheelchair with a youthful vigor and stretched out his back as if that was all it took to regain his strength. He had said, "Let's do away with this rusty old thing," and kicked the wheelchair behind him until it rolled over a cliff nearby. She recognized that cliff, even though it had been 10 years since she had seen it. Then he had tossed away his eyeglasses too. He had looked down at her with bright, clear eyes. The whites were not yellow but white, and the brown irises were not dull. He had reached up and plucked off her glasses too, and everything had blurred. "I can't see," she had told him. "Then listen," he had said gently, and repeated himself, but his voice suddenly had taken on its accustomed harshness. Listen to me for once, goddammit." He had then extracted the cotton she forgot was in her ears. She listened to the rumbling sound, like a far motorized boat on water or a car passing on the street late at night. She listened until the dog at her feet whimpered and the rumbling sound stopped. She woke to the dog's frantic twitching movements as it ran on its side of the bed. Some nights it relaxed her with its companionable light snore as they both fell asleep. For some reason, it always settled at her feet and left the other side of the bed vacant. And like tonight, it often whimpered and kicked her, as if chasing its own dream. She usually gave it a little nudge back with her toes until they both lay in the waking night. Now, though, the dog's snores had woken her from what seemed the most significant dream she had had in 10 years, and she kicked it hard enough that it stumbled off the bed and thrashed on the ground until it gained its feet. She immediately felt penitent and tried to coax the dog over. She patted the foot of the bed and called, "Come here, come on, come back up, be good, come on." It ignored her. and trotted out the room and down the hall to the dog door. A faint flap reached her ears from the other side of the house as it went outside. She closed her eyes and her dream escaped her, although she had a regretful intuition that it had been important not to forget. She had never wanted a dog. Her grown daughter had insisted on her having a companion animal to prevent the creeping loneliness that had manifested in her household management after her husband's death. She had removed all their framed photographs and his paintings from the walls and stored them in the garage wrapped in brown paper. She had boxed his knickknacks and folded his winter and summer clothes and had boxed those separately, as if seasons mattered to him anymore. Afterward, she realized how little of the home had actually belonged to her. There was an heirloom abacus that was hers, and a Galileo thermometer that read in Celsius. Even the ring on her left hand belonged to him. Little else represented her. "Nobody lives here," her daughter had said upon visiting. "What did you do with everything?" "Everything's in the garage," she said. Her apathy had long bothered her daughter, but it still hurt when she said, "And are your feelings in the garage too?" She fixed her daughter with a hard stare. "I have feelings for you and for my grandchild. I lost feelings for other things long ago." "Well, maybe you need to find something," her daughter suggested. "Join a club, a choir, anything." She fiddled with the abacus absently. "I don't sing," she said. The following day, when her daughter dropped off the dog, a small mixed breed chosen from the shelter and of age unknown, her daughter hefted its small wriggling bulk into her arms and said, "Something else for you to practice having feelings for." Someone had used dog perfume to try to conceal the awful odor matted into its fur. "It's a girl," her daughter said. "You can rename her." "I don't care," she said, as she felt it thump a wiry rat tail against her body. Alone with the dog, she carried it to the kitchen sink to bathe. As she lay awake in bed now, she thought about how it was just hard for her to grieve. People misunderstood her. They found her lacking in compassion or even a decent sense of humanity. But she had grieved during all the years he had been restricted to that wheelchair. She had grieved as she watched his will to continue his immobilized existence diminish and turn into a will to end it. They had once spoken about death in inevitable, almost comfortable terms when they were younger and farther from it, but as he approached his decision, neither of them even mentioned the word. And because of some sense of humanity, decent or not, she had helped him. Besides the dog, her closest companion for 10 years had been one particular voice on the evening radio. She had never endured political rants very well, so even during that hour the volume remained low, reducing the radio host's voice to a baritone hum. It reminded her of putting cotton in ears. In other words, it reminded her of her husband's voice. Otherwise, the radio was tuned to some other show, some station or other. It didn't matter which, it was just on, from dawn to almost 9 in the evening. Of course, she told her daughter that the radio was for the dog. Sympathetic loneliness struck her every time she saw the perk of the dog's ears, listening for apparitional sounds deep in the house where no one else lived. She stretched her feet into the space that the dog had vacated and fell back to sleep, and next the doorbell woke her. On the way to the door, she flicked on the radio. A garrulous radio voice chatted behind her like an inconsiderate neighbor. When she answered the door, the dawn was dyeing in soft whiter hues the sky behind a young man. There was a sweatshirt bundled in his arms. She noted again that he was young and probably wore many sweatshirts, but that did not explain why he silently offered the one in his arms to her. "Yes," she said, up to his shadowed face. "What is it you want?" The sun rose behind him and silhouetted him with a glow around his edges, his ears tinged red either from the effect or from embarrassment. A look that might have been recognition crossed his face. It surprised her when he began, "At night, I drive around to go to sleep. The motion soothes me, like a baby." He had a deep, slow pattern of speech. He was older than she had assumed, and he wore a ring on his left hand. Clutching the sweatshirt to his chest in a tight cradle, he said, "My parents, they used to do that for me, drive around so that I would sleep." She stood taller. "Is that all?" He stepped forward to set the sweatshirt in her arms, and it had a familiar, unexpected weight to it. He said, hands splayed in her direction, "I guess I still fall asleep." She knew what was in her arms then. She imagined the sweatshirt still held its heat. She stepped aside and said to him, "Come in." He followed her inside, and she shut the door. He twisted the ring around his finger in worrisome circles. It was too loose on him. "I'm sorry," he said, staring down at his boots. He stepped gingerly in place to inspect the mud adhered to the bottom. "Don't mind the shoes," she said. "Be good, come on," she said, when he still hesitated, aware that those were the exact words she had spoken to the dog a few hours before. She led him into the kitchen and set the bundled sweatshirt on the counter and started the coffee maker. Two sounds filled the silence between them, the radio and the percolation of the coffee. "This is an unapologetic household," she informed him. He was staring offended at where she had placed the sweatshirt. "Help yourself," she said, gesturing to the kitchen stools. "Sit." The young man scanned the empty walls, then redirected his eyes to the sweatshirt. "You know what's in there?" he asked, taking a seat. "I never wanted a dog," she told him. "Coffee?" She opened a cabinet and set down 2 coffee cups on the counter. "I assumed it's yours. I hid it right outside there," he said, gesturing toward the street through the window. He looked at the sweatshirt and seemed to wait for her to check inside. She had not often held the dog, but she thought she knew its weight just the same. She refused to lift open the sweatshirt, just as she knew if she had had the opportunity and presence of mind, she would not have looked over the cliff. The young man downed his coffee, as if he sensed something strange in her or in the house, or maybe he just remembered some other obligation. His teeth felt his tongue as if he had burnt it. He set down the cup and stood. It was on the hour, and the radio switched shows. Again he spun the loose ring around his finger. "I'll take off," he announced. "All right," she said. A woman's voice on the radio introduced the topics of the hour. He hadn't moved. "I owe you," he said. "What?" she replied. "A dog?" "If that's what you want." She began to wave him away and then thought, "A companion? If that's what you want, too." She stepped over to the radio and put a hand on it, but didn't turn it off. She faced the young man in her kitchen, now well lit from the risen sun. It shone obliquely through the windows and cast long shadows. Everything seemed to be in only 2 shades, light and dark. "You're serious?" she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Serious as the clouds. That's funny. Something my wife used to say." She took her purse off a peg and rifled through it to find her house key. "You still got that truck out there?" He reddened again. "Yes, ma'am." She picked up the bundled sweatshirt. "There's a shovel in the garage. The door's there. Get that for me," she said. "Then you'll drive me somewhere." "Where would you like to go?" he said, approaching the door. "A place that exists in my dreams," she said, "and up the canyon. You know the outlook?" He reddened again. "Doesn't everyone?" "Young and old. I remember it young, too," she said with a slim, bitter smile. "Well, we won't catch the sunrise, but go on, get that shovel." His truck struggled up into the foothills. The engine groaned, and cars passed them across the double line. "You might want to get your oil checked," she told him. "How do you know?" "I know a thing or two about cars," she informed him, "and I can read that indicator light on your dashboard." "I thought that was always on," he said. As he drove, she gazed out the window. Straw-like grass swept across the hillside, dotted with chunks of volcanic rock. Trees grew sparsely, wiry and dry, with a few clinging leaves. Once in a while, barbed wire marked off a cow pasture, and even early in the day, the cows collected in the little shade afforded to them by the trees. There were signs for the Outlook Vista a mile before they arrived. He turned into an empty row of parking spots. She got out with the bundled sweatshirt and walked around a set of wooden rails and approached the cliff that projected about 15 feet out. "Careful," the young man called. "People have fallen right there." She came back to him. "I know." He had the shovel. "Right there," she said, pointing toward a place that seemed penetrable. It might just be rock underneath, but he aimed the point down into the ground and came up with an inch of dirt. With his eyes, he sized the bundled sweatshirt, but he aimed the point down again, and again another inch lifted. He worked for 10 minutes or so, while she went and sat on the cliff. The sun disappeared behind low clouds and chilled the air and darkened the hillside and the vista before them. At first, a fluttering, almost girlish apprehension rose from her gut from the sheer drop below her, then a gust of emotions that she hardened herself against. She pressed a palm to the unforgiving, cold rock beneath her and shifted her weight since her rear was sore. She would need assistance to stand again. Knowing she would find none, she still looked at the 15 feet of rock projected out before her, for the marks of wheels, though he had not skidded, but rolled. She remembered hearing the release of the rusty brakes. "Let's do away with this old rusty thing," he had said, more to himself. She had not responded. He had said, "Go back toward the car now. Listen to me for once, goddammit." They had been on the safe side of the wooden rail, and the 15 feet of cliff top before them had seemed like no distance at all. The rail did not deter young people from lying on top of the cliff at night and blowing smoke into the air, their backs pressed to the cool surface. The stars seemed to be closer, and the vast darkness seemed to push them down harder into the rock. It had been early evening, and 5 or 6 of them had shown up. They hung out around their parked cars, slanting looks in their direction, waiting for them to leave, but not waiting to light up. A few had set up glass bottles, like bowling pins, and rolled a baseball down the length of empty parking lot. "Go talk to them," her husband insisted. There was a clanking sound, as bottles scattered across the asphalt. "No," she said. "I don't want you here," he said. "I should have come on my own." "How would you have managed that?" He groaned and looked at the lowering sun and down at the cliff. She had come to his side and touched his face. Tired brown eyes flicked up to hers and back down as if the weight of the lids were too heavy. Having broken all the bottles, they had begun tossing the baseball instead. The glittering pieces left on the asphalt caught her eye. "Get me a beer, will you?" he asked her, as if they were at home. "From them? Who else?" She had not wanted to leave him there. "Get it yourself," she said, and leaned against the rail. Without another word to her, he wheeled back from the cliff and over to the group of young people. She heard him say, "Spare a beer for an old man?" "Course," said one man with long hair who stepped forward to greet him. "For your wife, too?" No, her husband had replied. She's still got some driving to do. There was a clanging sound in the air. She turned to see the young man jabbing the shovel into the hole he had created. He dropped the shovel and stood in the hole, his legs disappearing, about a foot deep. He crawled out and with weary feet came over to where she sat and landed beside her. That's as deep as it'll go, he said. He laughed strangely and said, rock bottom. She returned her eyes to the cliff. That's fine. He spun his ring and cleared his throat. It's not so deep that something might not come and dig it back out. She turned to him again. Coyotes? He nodded. Most likely. She shrugged and turned back. No matter, she said. She reached upwards. Help an old woman up, will you? He stood and held her by both hands and pulled her up to her feet. She teetered a little and gripped the rail. He picked up the bundled sweatshirt, and they walked over to the hole. He set it in the hole and retrieved the shovel. Let's just think religious thoughts. I haven't prayed in so long, she said, and bowed her head and peeked up to watch him do the same. No appropriately reverent thoughts came to her. She wondered if she had locked the front door when they left. She felt a hollowness inside her that was not sadness, but plain primal hunger. After a minute or two, she called out, Amen. She took the shovel from him and felt along its splintered handle for her grip. It was heavier to lift than she expected, but she found herself able to push the dirt piled aside back into the hole. As she completed her task, she saw a faint metallic glimmer catch in the sun as something small dropped from the air and into the hole. In the truck, she finally realized what it had been. Your ring, she said, noticing his bare left hand on top of the steering wheel. He looked at her and away. They were descending now, the outlook behind them. It just seemed like a good place to bury things, he said. Memories? Sort of. She smiled at him. You're a good guy. If she left you, she'd be better off dead. I killed your dog, he reminded her. Braking, he wove the truck around some roadkill. And she is dead. She grappled for an apology. Forgive me, was all she could say. Giving her a tight smile, he said, This is an unapologetic truck. She replied, That's untrue. This truck has been filled with your apologies ever since we got inside. I'm not that sorry for your dog, he confessed. She touched her own ring absently, but could not spin it around her finger as it fit too tight to remove anymore. He glanced down at her hands. I'm more sorry for your husband. She stiffened, and every knuckled bone of her spine seemed to grind against the adjacent ones. A column of bitter brittleness held her erect in her seat. I was there that night, he explained. Your husband gathered us around him like old friends. You called us hooligans. I did not, she said. After a few beers, you called us your children. She faced away from him as best she could in the truck cab, face flushed. I don't remember if you or your husband started the conversation about death, but neither of you could stop talking about it. You both had so much to say. It was like you had both dammed it up inside you and finally let it go. He was animated now. His voice was more expressive and alive. And you know what? I remember something you said. You said, if death is a sunset, then there's got to be something after. There's got to be stars. Her own recollections from that night were blurred at best. The most concrete details she now had, she had read in the newspaper the next day. Other people had shied away from her, and she wondered if they knew what had really happened. And you know, the young man said, my wife remembered that too. Maybe that's why those words have stayed with me. Years later, When we found out that she had cancer, I kept repeating to myself the doctor's words like end stage, but she kept repeating yours. There's got to be stars, she said. It was almost midday. The sun was high, and short shadows were on the ground. The cows flicked their tails, and those not under the shrunken circumference of shade under the trees resigned themselves to the sun. They rode in silence as the foothill bottomed out. They passed through intersections and focused on the general busyness around them. "Anywhere else you need to go?" he offered. She tried to force her eyes to meet his. "Don't be so good," she said, in a pleading tone. 10 minutes later, they arrived at her house. He walked her to the door. "This isn't a date," she told him. "I can walk myself." "I haven't been on a date in so long," he said. "Find someone your own age," she suggested harshly. They stood at the front door, as if waiting for someone on the other side to let them in. She knew he had not intended to kiss her, but he did, right on her pale lips in the brightness of day. It lasted less than a second, but she had still automatically closed her eyes. She didn't remember a last kiss with her husband on the cliff top. She hoped it had happened. She hoped that he had known in that kiss forgiveness and understanding and hope. It had not been her goodbye, but her acceptance. He had believed in nothing but darkness after death. It was one instance in which they had always differed. The door had not been locked after all. And after she went inside, she turned up the volume of the radio and shed her jacket and her shoes. Then, overheated and unthinking, she pulled off garment after garment until she stood naked in the living room, the floor scattered with her clothes and the bare walls staring coldly back at her. She inspected the walls and ran her hands over the surface for the holes where she had pulled out the nails. She padded into the garage and carried one of his largest paintings into the house, the brown paper rough against her skin. She was kneeling to rip off the paper when she heard a faint flap from somewhere else in the house. The unmistakable sound of paws against the floor failed to register with her until the dog stood before her, its wiry rat tail tapping and tapping against the brown paper. The tapping sound hypnotized her and blended with the radio voice in a song that seemed unreal, but to which she listened and listened. She strained to hear the beating of her own heart. She knew it was there, even if she could not hear it, and she wondered, as she reached out for the dog and felt its chest, if those rhythms were in sync. The tail, the voice, her heartbeat, the dog's, until the radio changed and a new voice came on.